Today we're going to be talking about autism spectrum disorders in the classroom in general and then specifically in the secondary classroom environment. Autism spectrum disorders is really a broad term that's used to talk about 5 main disorders that are all characterized by similar conditions. Those disorders, as you can see, are autism itself, Asperger's disorder, childhood disintegrative disorder, Rett's disorder, and then pervasive developmental disorder, which is not otherwise specified. Children with ASD, regardless of which of those specific disorders they have, often have very similar characteristics as far as varying degrees of difficulty when it comes to social functioning. They are often not included in a school setting. They struggle with social integration. They also struggle with communication skills. And then they also struggle with repetitive and stereotyped patterns of behavior. Some of the learning characteristics of the students with ASD, as you can see, usually these relate to behavioral or social problems. They are easily confused whenever teachers give ambiguous assignments that may have multiple components. This is not because the students do not understand the concept, but usually because they have trouble categorizing and prioritizing what to focus on. They have difficulty picking out important concepts on their own. They may have difficulty processing large amounts of auditory information. Many of these students you will see in the classroom have a desire for perfection, and although we want students to strive to do their best, this desire for perfection often gets in the way of their learning. The students get very distracted by the need for everything they write or everything they do to be to a certain standard, and then they cannot focus on the material at hand. Many times they have difficulty following routines and then picking up on social cues, which can lead to having difficulty with transitions in the classroom. And then a lot of these students will have narrow interests, and that will lead to them also being easily distracted. If the material that a teacher is presenting is not within that interest, they have a lot of trouble focusing on the content that's being taught in the classroom. So there are some instructional tips that all teachers should be aware of. Students with ASD are in our classrooms every day, and we need to make sure we know how to address their instructional needs. And one of the main things we can do is to try to use an antecedent management strategy instead of a contingency management strategy. And the difference in the two is that an antecedent management strategy anticipates the struggles that these children may have and tries to set up a learning environment ahead of time that will be conducive to learning, that will eliminate some of these distractions, and that will allow for all children, especially those with autism spectrum disorders, to focus fully on the content at hand. Contingency management strategies are what we see a lot of times in the classroom, where teachers may set procedures for their classroom, but generally the management part of the classroom comes into place when students misbehave or when we notice there is a problem. So it's important for these students to be successful that we anticipate the struggles that they're going to have, and we try to set up an environment that will help them focus before they run into behavioral problems. One of the things to make sure we understand about students with ASD is that they are typically capable of learning the same material as other students. Cognitively, they can understand and they can learn. The interventions that we need to have in the classroom are not changing what we teach for these students, but instead it's changing how we teach these students. As you saw on some of the previous slides, most of the trouble that these students have are because of social problems or because maybe of focus issues that they may have. And so as teachers, we need to use some interventions that will allow these students to focus, to concentrate on the tasks at hand, to minimize distractions for these students, So it's not that we're making interventions to alter the content, but we're altering how we teach that content. So there are some instructional tips that we can look at to help us throughout the classroom. Some of those are to highlight the most important concepts for the students, whether we are giving them notes ahead of time or with notes that are being given on the board. It's important to highlight for these students what's most important to focus on as they have trouble narrowing down a broad set of information to the most important topics. Providing these students with some options, giving them choices for how they complete assignments, whether those are tests, homework assignments, classroom assignments. Sometimes giving these students options is one of the best things we can do for them in the classroom. We need to prepare the student. And what that means is that we need to prepare them ahead of time for what they're walking into that day. So in my classroom in particular, in a secondary environment, I try to create unit plans ahead of time, assignment sheets that I can give to the students so that when they come to class that day, they know what to expect. They know maybe what type of activities we're doing, what content we're going to be focusing on, where they can find that in the book. And giving them that structure really helps them to succeed academically. Giving these students graphic or visual organizers is also a great way to help them focus on the important information and then to help them stay organized. Using mnemonic devices is a great way also for them to focus in on what is most important, not to get bogged down with the little details and to help them remember. We want to increase the time that they spend on task. And this, we know, of course, is not just for students with ASD, but for any student. While the students are in our classroom, we want them to be on task. And so there are several things we can do to help promote on-task time instead of losing time. And one of the things we can do is to make sure we have smooth transitions within our classroom, whether we're transitioning from lecture to practice assignments to an activity, maybe some group work, working on the computers. Making sure we have smooth transitions during our classes can help increase the time that the students have on task. And then, of course, we want to maximize attention during class instruction. And for many of the students with ASD, that may mean preferential seating for those students. Giving them something, giving a seating arrangement that allows them to focus in on wherever the instruction is taking place can eliminate some distractions otherwise within the classroom. Okay, these charts show some tips for each of those categories. I'm not going to read through all of them, but they are there for you to glance over. The first table there on the left shows some tips for how to highlight the most important concepts for the students. And so highlighting may physically mean highlighting on a piece of paper, or it may mean just picking out, for example, sending home a summary sheet so that students can have some guidance for the next couple days' lessons. Writing out step-by-step instructions for the students so they know exactly what's expected of them. Those are some different ways that teachers in the classroom can highlight some important concepts. There on the right in Table 2, that shows some tips for how to provide alternate modes for completing assignments. I feel like a lot of times as teachers we get in a rut for giving the same type of assignment. We like our multiple choice tests, or we like something that we can have written to turn in, but for these students we have to think about giving them some options. And so there are many ways to alter assignments so that the same content is still assessed, but it gives the students some creativity in how they choose to demonstrate their knowledge, their competency. So some of the things that are listed here may include making posters or giving presentations, perhaps using audio or video equipment, or using the computer to read a passage or to take notes on a computer instead of pencil and paper. Here in Table 3, we have some tips for preparing the student in advance. I already mentioned giving an outline, perhaps of the unit or of the upcoming week, so that they have that to work on. Giving them books or materials to go ahead and read ahead of time so that they have an understanding before they come to class of what material we're going to be covering. Using graphic organizers was another suggestion for how to help these students stay on task. That not only helps the students focus in on what's important, but it also gives them something to focus in on while you are lecturing, while you're giving information to the students. This gives them a visual, something that they can fill in and follow along with to help them stay on task. Some ways to use mnemonic devices. are to have them use mnemonic devices to help visualize key information. So if there is something you want the students to remember from that particular day, you might want to use a mnemonic device to help them remember those important facts. Obviously, you don't want to overuse mnemonic devices because then the students could get confused on what each mnemonic device meant. But using them to highlight key information, things that they need to be able to remember, is a good way to implement using mnemonic devices in your classroom. To help increase time on task, down in Table 6, you see a couple of different examples. But one is just to provide a visual way to monitor what students are completing and what needs to be completed. Sometimes that perhaps giving them a checklist, okay, to help them know where they need to be by the time the class is over. It helps them stay on task, it helps them stay organized, know what's expected of them. And of course, we need some tips for helping to maximize attention during whole class instruction. And this is something that might be helpful for all students, not just those who have ASD. But of course, we've already mentioned preferential seating the student near the front of the classroom, or perhaps maybe not in the front of the classroom, but just in a place where they will have the least amount of distractions. Sometimes students can benefit from having earplugs or having headphones to help them eliminate some extra noises if it's an appropriate time. Helping the students to organize the information that's being read is also a good way to help them stay on task. So again, that could be using the graphic organizers like we already mentioned. Getting to know your students and using references to things that they are personally interested in is a great way to pull students into your lecture. If students are particularly interested in a certain sport or in a certain type of movie or activity, when they hear you referencing those things that they are interested in outside of the classroom, that can pull their attention back to whatever it is you are talking about related to your content. So those little cues that you can use to help grab their attention and pull them back into the moment can really help them stay on task. And then we have tips for helping to prepare for instructional and for classroom transitions. And for these students, order is very important, order and structure, and so it's important that as we transition from one activity to another, that those transitions are very smooth. My school, for example, is on a block schedule, and so the students are in our classroom for approximately 90 minutes at a time. So within that 90-minute block, we may be doing several different activities or several different things throughout the day. We want to make sure that as we transition from one activity to another, or from one learning task to another, that the students have clear expectations of what is going on, that they understand what they're supposed to be doing now versus what they were doing in the last section of the lesson. So perhaps preparing a schedule for those students ahead of time so they know what to expect. I think it's a great idea on your unit plans, or if you're giving out weekly schedules for the students so that they can anticipate what's coming. If you include a list of maybe the activities that will be done that day, so that when they look at that, they can see on Monday they're going to be doing these 3 different activities during the classroom. So they know to anticipate those activities that are coming up, and they also know to anticipate that different types of activities are coming up within the same day's lesson. Okay, so looking back at some of the tips that we have had throughout this presentation, there are several things that jumped out to me as just some key strategies that teachers could use, not just secondary teachers, but teachers at any level could use to help promote metacognitive learning in these students. Just because they may have been diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder does not mean that they are not capable of learning and learning material at a very deep level. So one of the things that I think is most important is embedding the choices into the classroom. We mentioned finding alternate assignments earlier, and that is very important for the students. It allows the students to express their preferences. Each of these students, as we mentioned, may have a very narrow interest that they are fixated on. And so giving them some choices, allowing them to express these interests into their work will really grab their attention. Also giving them some choices may provide some social opportunities for these students that are key in their development. We're not only teaching content to these students, but we hope that when they leave our classrooms that they are better learners. And so giving these students some social opportunities where they may work with each other can really help not only to increase their understanding of the material, but also to increase their confidence and their ability to work with others. Giving them some options also increases their motivation. They are much more motivated to work when they feel like it's something that they have chosen to do. And then, of course, it does promote independence. And one of the things that we know in metacognitive learners is that they take that responsibility for themselves. They take responsibility for their own learning. And this is something that we want to promote all children to do, but especially those with ASD. We need to encourage them and give them a little bit of extra support so that they feel like they are able to be independent learners. Okay, another strategy that is a great way to help promote the metacognitive learning is to use the graphic organizers. And although that may seem like a very simple thing to implement in your classroom, graphic organizers, I feel like, play a great role in developing some note-taking and some guidance and some focus for these students. A lot of students with ASD are very visual learners. They do not do well with a great deal of auditory information. And so as teachers, we try not to lecture for long periods of time, but sometimes there is just not a better way of getting across the information than just to tell the students, to show them, to explain to them. And so giving these students graphic organizers during those times when we do find ourselves lecturing or giving information verbally is a great way for them to not only have some guidance as you make your way through the content, they can follow along visually on their paper, but it also gives them some structure. One of the benefits is that these students already have a graphic organizer developed for them. They can just follow along. But over time, we hope that these students can start to construct their own organizers themselves. So maybe at the beginning of a class, of the semester, of the year, depending on your schedule, the students would be given a graphic organizer with which they would follow along during the class and fill in as they go. However, midway through the semester, perhaps start changing that graphic organizer a little bit, maybe putting the boxes there for the main ideas, but not filling in what they are. Having the students to try to figure out, well, what was the main idea of that lesson or of the last few minutes? What were we really talking about? And then hopefully over time, you can kind of release some of that responsibility to the students so that you can give them an outline or give them a framework, but then they are able to fill in a lot of the important information without your guidance. So ultimately, as we try to think about what metacognitive learning looks like in these students, we want them to have that self-responsibility. We want them to be able to guide their own learning, and this is a great way to gradually release that responsibility from the teacher, giving the graphic organizer, hopefully to the student being able to create their own graphic organizer for note-taking and for following along. And a third strategy to help promote metacognitive learning in students has to do with self-assessing. And we know that metacognitive learners are great at self-assessing their own learning, their own progress, setting goals for themselves. And so we should also encourage that behavior in students within the classroom. One of the articles that we have referenced talks about a meta-memory study. And not just talking about the capability of the students to remember facts, but what is their awareness of their memory performance? And the study showed that a greater awareness of memory performance affects academic performance. And so as we ask these students ahead of time to make predictions about how much they will remember, about how they will perform, that is cueing those students in to the things that they need to be learning throughout the unit or throughout the lesson. The study also showed that students who have ASD can self-regulate their learning. They are capable of doing that. And I think that teachers a lot of times, when we see a label on a student that, oh, they have been diagnosed with a certain disorder, we automatically put limitations on their abilities, on their cognitive abilities. So it's important to remember that these students are capable of regulating their own learning. It's just they need a little bit of guidance, a little bit of support in knowing how to do that. So a great way to do that is to ask students to make judgments of their memory function, and that will help increase their performance. So we know the power of pre-assessing within our classroom for content reasons, but it's important for these students when we pre-assess, when we talk about material before we actually cover it, to have them think about how much they already know, how much they expect to remember, what they expect their performance to be. And by increasing questions like that, by asking them to self-assess, we are making the students more aware of their learning than just by receiving a test score at the end of the unit. There's a great deal of information available about autism spectrum disorders specifically and even more in general. I've just tried to highlight some of the things that I found to be most interesting, and not just most interesting to me, but that I feel like everyone can apply within their classrooms. So these are some of the articles that I use to pull this information from, but like I said, there are many, many more articles out there where you can find great information about autism